Your work is largely about making the case that psychedelics are a better form of treatment than other forms. Before we get there, though, what do you make of a massive growth in the crisis of mental health?
More and more experts are sounding the alarm on what they say is a mental health crisis.
We are seeing mental health concerns at a rate that is extreme and very concerning.
In the United States, for the first time, the lifespan, instead of increasing, it's now decreasing.
With mental illness affecting roughly 50 million US adults, federal regulators are starting to explore the therapeutic potential of once stigmatized psychedelics. So today on the show, I'm speaking with Dr. Matthew Johnson. He's one of the most cited researchers in psychedelic therapy, and he believes it can play a key role in treating mental illness.
Psychedelic therapy is about blasting people out of that narrative. They have such power to change people's lives, including some very serious risks too.
We'll also take a field trip south of the border to visit a psychedelic treatment facility using a lesser-known drug called ibogaine to treat addiction and trauma. Stay tuned as we unpack a range of issues, including our current mental health crisis, how it's opened the door to a psychedelic renaissance, and how we might, in our excitement about them, overlook some of their potential risks. The only way to solve our biggest problems is to have the audacity to try. Welcome to In the Arena with Evan Baehr. All right, I know you're on the road all the time, going to events, crafting the future of psychedelics. Are these sort of like Star Wars bar? Are these sort of a crazy set of people that come together working in the space that you're in right now?
That's a good analogy. I think it's like, yeah, like the Star Wars cantina kind of feel. The environment has changed, you know, so 20 years ago, about the time when I jumped in this area, it was all hippies and a few token scientists, like one or two token scientists. And so now in the last, gosh, like 4 years or so, you have this like very fascinating mix of like academics like me, folks with dreadlocks, tie-dye, et cetera, and then folks that are, you know, talking about the financial world that, you know, it just goes over my head, you know, a lot of it. So it's a really cool mix, interesting.
Many headlines in publications around the world tell us that we are in a mental health crisis. Explain that to us.
Things seem to be getting worse and not better despite many, many decades of supposed advancement. From one aspect, let's take depression. The most common antidepressants, the SSRIs, so to speak, they really don't work any better than the antidepressants going back to the 1950s. They're somewhat safer than some of those original antidepressants, but we've reached a ceiling in terms of the number of people that can be affected. And another big data point that keeps going in this direction is several years ago, for the first time in recorded history, in the United States, for most Americans, the lifespan, instead of increasing as it had done for many years, it's now decreasing. So it's like, you know, with all the extra technology, with all the advancements, with all the, you know, the new medical care, why are people living less long? Well, the analyses are pretty clear. It's suicide and various forms of substance use problems, you know, ODing or dying from lung cancer, heart disease from tobacco, alcohol, you know, the other substances. So these are squarely in the mental health realm.
The high-level stats on the mental health crisis are pretty staggering. I think 1 in 5 American adults are depressed, 1 in 20 are severely depressed. I think about 10% of American adults take an SSRI, an antidepressant, in response to that. How did we get here?
Right. Well, what was considered depression in the early days was a much more severe form of depression. So the antidepressants that were prescribed back in the 1960s, for example, you really had to be at the more severe end of the spectrum of depression to be prescribed medication. So there has been some shift in terms of what is even recognized as depression. In my opinion, there certainly is some over-prescription of these medications. I don't want to overstate it because certainly they've helped plenty of people, and you know, we need those tools in the toolbox, but we're not supposed to be happy all the time. Being happy about something is a signal in terms of the evolutionary psychology that oh, this is good. Oh, I've gotten food or sex or water, something I need. So I'm kind of rewarded for it. I feel good. And so the organism, we do the same thing in the future. It keeps the species going. So, but if you were happy all the time, including when bad stuff happened, you wouldn't have that signal, oh, maybe I shouldn't be doing this anymore. So for example, let's say someone's stuck in a dead-end job that's unfulfilling and they've got an abusive boss, for example, and they're depressed. The number one thing that person can do for their depression is to look into a better job. Them not being happy a lot is a signal that they're in a difficult place in life and they need to do some exploration.
Talk about that person for a second. The person who experienced some depression, perhaps as a result of a life circumstance that, let's just assume for the sake of argument, they have the ability to control. They need to leave a relationship,
Right.
They need to leave a job, they need to change their health, change their city, something.
Right.
And they're given an SSRI. Do you see that as sort of numbing that person in a way that leads them to not seek the root cause?
Yeah. And in fact, there's some evidence that these medications do numb the person. And I don't want to overstate it because for some folks that may be what they need. Now, originally, SSRIs were designed with the intent of shorter term use. So let's say you're so depressed that you can't get out of bed. The more sophisticated and enlightened idea from the get-go was, okay, go on these medications, you're gonna be able to get out of bed. During that window of opportunity, we want you to, whatever it is for that person, work on your relationship, start trying, join some clubs if you're socially isolated, different ways to find, friends, do those things, work on that relationship with your kids that's been deteriorated. Use that window of opportunity to improve your life. And then you can go off the antidepressants because you've put yourself in a better place in life and you can move forward. Now, how many times are they actually used like that? Very rarely. And so it's very typical for folks to just, go on these medications and stay on them for the rest of their lives or for decades.
All right, let's talk about psychedelics. For newcomers, what is a psychedelic?
Psychedelics are hard to define, and you ask experts and you're gonna get different opinions on what that word means. For me, it's a substance, a drug, that has a profound effect on one's perception of reality. And included in that perception of reality is one's perception of oneself. So other drug classes, stimulants are the uppers, and benzodiazepines, they're a type of downer, and you have uppers and downers. I call psychedelics the all-arounders. I really took that from Cheech and Chong, so as an academic, I have to cite my sources. But they don't have a reliable direction to their push. They've been called magnifiers of the mind. And that's why someone can have one of the most blissful experiences of their life that they didn't even think was possible, but at the same time, and maybe 2 minutes later, could have one of the most frightening or the most frightening, hellish experience of their life. So they're drugs that have that profound effect on one's sense of reality. There are the so-called classic psychedelics, like psilocybin, which is in magic mushrooms, or LSD, or DMT, which is in ayahuasca, or mescaline, that's in peyote cactus. Those are all classic psychedelics. They work in a pretty particular way in the brain. Their primary activity is by stimulating a certain type of serotonin receptor. It's called the serotonin 2A receptor. But then you have other compounds that are also called psychedelics. Some experts don't want to call them psychedelics. I think it is fair to call them psychedelics, like MDMA, which works through a different way. It releases serotonin from one's synapses, naturally created serotonin from their synapses in the brain, and some other compounds like ketamine, which works not on the serotonin system, but on the glutamate system, another neurotransmitter system in the brain. And then there's other ones like ibogaine and salvia divinorum. They all work through a variety of different ways, but they do have that effect of profoundly altering one's perception of reality.
If SSRIs essentially numb you into complacency, what is the analogy there? You would say psychedelics what? If it's not numb you into complacency, it is psychedelics what?
They put life into your face. So by analogy, if you have kind of put something away in the basement of your mind, like, I don't want to deal with that. If you've been avoidant, many of us are avoidant, what people typically do is maybe take the broom and sweep their problems under the rug. And so it's been said that psychedelic therapy may be more like taking that rug outside, throwing it over a tree limb, and taking the broom and beating the hell out of that rug. And all the dust flies out from underneath it, and you really get to the root of the issues. So people don't feel checked out. And in fact, when people come out, they have this very salient sense of having done their own heavy lifting. You know, so when people don't really understand it and they hear about this and they say, oh, well, another magic pill, another thing to just, automatically make people feel better, and they're not getting it because people's issues are really placed on them. Good psychedelic therapy tends to make you want to take care of your shit, like lift yourself up by your bootstraps to the degree possible and take that personal responsibility and move forward.
You've really become one of the most cited researchers in this field. What was your own journey into this area of discovery?
Well, as I was a young college student, a number of threads came together. Like one, on the academic side, I was interested in behavioral psychology and also essentially the neuroscience or the science of drugs. And really ranging from caffeine to alcohol to things like cocaine. I did some research in rats with cocaine when I was a college student. And I was also interested in the concept of behavior change. How do you get, people to change? How do you, change the environment to encourage healthy functioning? And so I did a paper in college and learned this history that psychedelics were used to help, like LSD in the 1960s, used to help people overcome alcoholism. And I discovered that it wasn't as if the research had been done and it was conclusive that, oh, this didn't work, and so the medical field moved on. The history was much different. It was, oh, there were some really promising findings, and it looked like a lot of people were helped. But then psychedelics went from being this, arcane thing that was known only by these, laboratory clinical researchers in the early 60s, 50s, and then early 60s to being wildly popular in the late 60s and then into the 70s. And so it was really that association with that popularity, the association with the counterculture at the time, with so many of the changes in societies we associate with the 60s, psychedelics got the blame for that. So as a young scientist interested in behavior change, I thought, this is crazy. They have such power to change people's lives, including some very serious risks too.
Tell us a little bit about coming out of this period of dark ages of psychedelics. It sounded like nearly all the research was banned or severely limited, and your professional work is kind of at the turning point of that. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I got involved with psychedelic research in 2004, and that was around near the beginning of what I would say is modern era. So just a very small number of studies started to creep up in the mid-1990s.
Can I ask, the ones that happened in the 90s, were those illegal?
No, there was some legal research. For example, the first research that happened with some of the classic psychedelics since, that earlier era that ended in the early 70s, that happened under FDA-approved research at the University of New Mexico. But those are very early days. None of the studies at that point were therapeutic. In other words, these were basic studies to understand what the heck is it doing in the brain? What do people have to say about the experiences that they have on these substances? And typically, the participants needed to have used the drug before, because to get FDA approval, they want to make sure you're not harming anyone. So, well, at least get people that have already used psychedelics so you won't screw up their brain anymore in case it does that.
Tell us a bit about ibogaine in particular.
Ibogaine is a really fascinating compound. It's actually, in terms of the way it works in the brain, it's sort of a hodgepodge of different mechanisms shared by other psychedelics. So there's a little bit of an overlap with classic psychedelics, a little bit of overlap with some of the other classes of psychedelics. But what it's really been known for is really helping people with addiction. People reported this amazing experience of it halting their heroin addiction, where they no longer had cravings in the short term for heroin. And we also know that it normalizes the dopamine response in the brain. So the rewards center that we all have in our brains, where in an addicted person, even in an addicted rat, there's a wild fluctuation in dopamine response. And that has been flattened when you give an animal ibogaine. So there's a lot of excitement about its use for addiction. There's more concern compared to some of the other psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD, which are really remarkably safe at the physiological level. There is some concern with ibogaine that for people with some vulnerabilities that it could be particularly more dangerous. So it's really important that people be medically supervised when we do that type of work.
All right, we've come to the portion of the show where it's time to take a field trip. Let's break from our conversation to visit a psychedelic clinic in Cancun, Mexico, using ibogaine to treat people struggling with addiction and trauma. Hi, John.
Hi, how are you?
Welcome to Beyond. How are you?
I'm okay, thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Let's go.
Thank you. I've never done this before. I have not ever done psychedelics. I'm very anxious. I injured myself at the age of 17. I injured my back. The first thing they did was give me oxycodone. I was told to take it correctly, and about 4 years in, it became an addiction.
When someone takes an opiate like oxycodone for pain, it makes the pain go away. But if they keep taking that opiate, they eventually become dependent on it. And that can be very dangerous.
I then went to treatment in the United States. I chose Suboxone. 10 years later, I was still on Suboxone. I tried 12 times to get off of it by myself, and I was unable to. And I came to Beyond because I became very desperate.
This is our outdoor area where guests hang out. Yoga happens back here often, and then there's typically group therapy in the mornings over there.
Talia Eisenberg discovered the potential of ibogaine after a single dose helped end her multi-year heroin addiction.
When I did try ibogaine and I didn't have any craving for opiates after being an opiate addict, I thought, wow, we are really on to something.
But it was administered in a small house with no preparation. No medical infrastructure, no psychotherapy, and no aftercare. That's what motivated her and her co-founder, Tom Fiegel, to start Beyond. Upon arrival, you can't help but feel like you're at a boutique resort. There's massage therapy, fresh fruit juice, a staff chef, even those towel swans on the beds. The set and setting here is intentionally aimed to help individuals transition from their psychedelic treatment.
Ibogaine is not a recreational substance. It's not something anybody would do and go to a concert. It's a very challenging experience.
This is the ibogaine treatment room where clients have their primary doses and their booster doses. There's always a few nurses that are present, and the physicians are in and out, just checking to make sure that their vitals are looking good and that everything is safe.
The experience itself lasts 12 hours in a very intense psychedelic trip. And when it's done, the part of their brain that needed the opiate has been reset. It's back to pre-opiate levels of dependency. It's like they never took it.
What we are doing here is preparing the ibogaine for giving to our patients, and we dosify it in capsules. And this capsule has to be weighed before it being administered to our patients, because as they are handcrafted, they don't have like a fixed official weight as other medications. So a treatment will be requiring 8 to 10 capsules, depending on patient's weight and for a specific treatment programs.
You ready, guys?
Yep.
There are 5 phases in Beyond's delivery model. It's preparation before you arrive, pre-treatment once you arrive, the treatment itself, acute aftercare, and long-term aftercare when you're back home.
The day of your treatment, they will do an EKG. As long as your heart is okay, they will take you into a room. You get into bed, they hook you up to an EKG machine and a blood pressure sensor and an oxygen sensor. They bring you your dose, you take the dose. Nothing happens at first, actually. It takes about a half hour, 45 minutes. And then you start to hear a buzzing noise in your ear. That's your signal that your trip's about to begin.
Imagine you could have a photo of all your memories, all the beautiful ones and all the challenging ones, presented to you very fast.
And it shows you some things you don't want to see. Things that you did wrong and the things that you said to people that maybe you shouldn't have.
That lasts for about 6 hours. Then there's an introspective phase, and this is another about 4 to 6 hours where you're just contemplating what just happened and what it all means.
Afterwards, it takes a day to recover. You still have the electrified feeling in your body, but your brain, it feels like you've never touched a drug in your life.
Ibogaine is the only substance we know that is not an opiate that eliminates the withdrawals and cravings from opiate dependency. It's resetting the kappa opioid receptor, which is the receptor that is being agonized by the opiate. In addition, ibogaine is very effective at upregulating a protein called GDNF, and it causes someone to feel this sense of intention to grow and to change. Right? That's the big picture, right? That's the intergenerational healing. And then finally, there's the resetting of the serotonin system. So now we have extremely low or no sense of depression, plus this passion to grow and change, plus the absence of the withdrawals. And so what ibogaine helps people do is jumpstart their sense of change. There are, of course, some risks. So when someone takes ibogaine, they can experience a change in the pattern of their heart rate. And we have to be very careful about the potential risks to someone who's had a previous cardiac event. I think we're in this very strange time when self-motivated healing and access to safe medicines are challenging the conventional, largely Western medical industrial complex and the rules that have been put in place. The future of medicine is changing. I think that psychedelic technologies are being better understood for their true potential and their promise to help people heal and live the life that they want to.
It's fascinating to see the psychedelic treatment process firsthand, but let's get back to the studio and dive deeper into the science of these compounds. I'd love to hear some of your science or speculation on the magic that is happening in these 6 hours. I know often this might be used for someone that has a traumatic experience in their history, driving some of their depression or anxiety. Maybe you could take that as an example and tell us what you know about what's happening during those 6 hours.
So we know that when that drug is in the system, when the psilocybin, for example, is in their bloodstream, it gets to their brain and it hits these certain type of serotonin receptors. And we know that the downstream effects of that are a massive change in the way the brain communicates with itself. I liken it to an analogy with society when the internet came in. Without the psychedelic on board, certain brain areas that are closer to each other and that are in the same sort of common pattern with each other, they'll talk more with each other. These are like neighbors. In the old days before the internet, you knew your neighbors typically, and you talked to them more than the people across town and more than certainly the people across the planet. When the psychedelic is on board, there's really this kind of scramble of the communication. So there seems to be less communication with those normal communication partners. We're talking about different brain areas at the expense of this massive increase in communication between brain areas that don't normally communicate with each other. So that's like the internet moving into society. So we still have a lot to figure out here, but that's probably responsible for a lot of the insights and the radically different perceptions that people have in these experiences, where they can, for example, look at themselves from a different perspective. You mentioned trauma. There's often a lot of self-blame with trauma, and with psychedelic therapy, when it works well, sometimes it sounds to me like people will see themselves the way they would see a loved one or even a stranger. They would afford a loved one or even a stranger more compassion and understanding than they would themselves. You know, such as looking back and say, of course I didn't deserve that. That wasn't my fault. And it's so compelling because I think they're stumbling upon something we can call ground truth. Now, psychedelics don't always show you ground truth. You can have delusions too, and it's sort of shaking up the snow globe, and you get a lot of stuff, maybe, false positives as well as genuine insights. But sometimes it seems like it's genuine in the sense that it is so compelling that even when the drug wears out, like, they still remember it, and they are still moved by that, and it still makes just as much sense to them, maybe even more, when they're sober, when the drug is worn off, and they keep a lot of that perspective. What's probably happening in those experiences is that the brain is rewiring those very memories. We know that from basic memory research that every time we remember something, it's not like we're picking up on an exact recording of the event. We know that every time we remember something, we're making that memory, this is outside of psychedelics, we're making that memory more malleable. We're making it more adjustable. So with psychedelic therapy, when someone has sometimes, like, after years and maybe even decades of only this other suboptimal way of looking at the issue, now they have this very compelling alternate way of looking at it that is so compelling that that is the new memory that's written. And so now when they think of that event the next day or a week later or maybe even a year later, that's the memory they're pulling up. They've rewired what that memory is and all the connections that it has. The fight or flight impulse that it normally would trigger is no longer there, for example.
When you talk about rewiring the brain, is there an invisible hand or something driving that rewiring so that 6 hours later, it is stitched together in a way that it actually leads the person to flourish?
So we know even in rats that these compounds, the psychedelics, can induce what's called neuroplasticity, different ways of making the brain neurons more flexible, having them form new connections and perhaps even growing new neurons themselves. And so I think human beings in general have this tendency towards mental health growth. I think about it this way: if I cut my hand, we don't know how that scar is formed. There's still today, like, we have, a billion years of evolution behind us bringing the organism towards growth. So it's self-healing. The hand heals itself. And even in the best of medicine, get in a motorcycle accident in the ER, the basic things they're going to do are just helping your natural healing processes along. They're going to get the dirt, they're going to clean it out. They're going to maybe bring the skin closer together with stitching, but all of the healing is natural. Your body is doing it. Why would the mind be any different? It's just another aspect of our body. So I really do think the human being is generally driven towards psychological health. Maybe psychedelic therapy is like the emergency room physician clearing out the dirt, and you're never going to get that healing jump-started when you got a bunch of, like, the road gravel still in your cut. And so they're clearing out and allowing for that natural healing to happen. So I think there is this tendency towards growth.
When you think about applying this tool to the huge problem of mental health, what are some of the conditions that you're most excited about, conditions that feel so intractable through other forms of therapy that you have early indications of psychedelics as a real solution for?
I think the two biggies are addictions and so-called affective disorders, mainly depression. And the fascinating thing is, like, even within addictions, the early evidence suggests that it's not just for one form of addiction, let's say, alcoholism, or, addiction to, cocaine, addiction to tobacco, but there's emerging evidence that it works for many of these different addictions. So the exciting thing is that rather than operating at the surface level, like a lot of addiction medications, such as, let's say, methadone or Suboxone for opioid addiction, has a lot of benefits, but it works by essentially quelling the results. It's a safer form of the same basic drug. Psychedelics don't work like that. And I think they work at a much more fundamental level. When you really define what addiction is, it's not about the craving for this drug or, whether it's tobacco or cocaine. The real fundamental commonality, and I've always been interested scientifically in the commonalities across these forms of addictions, like what nets them together. And it really comes down to this narrative of the self, like, who am I? Like, what's really important to me? And I've been telling myself I need to change this for years, decades, and I keep doing the same damn thing. Like, what does that mean? What is life about? Like, what's my story? And none of the traditional psychiatric medications touch that at all. They're just quelling symptoms. And sometimes that's what folks need, and it can help some people to some degree. But the reason I think psychedelics are showing such promising evidence for addiction is they allow the person to step back and to grapple with those big picture narrative questions about who they are and how they're living their life. And in a certain respect, I think that's the same thing going on with depression. Because of psychedelic research, I've come to view depression as just another form of addiction, where instead of being stuck in this looped pattern of administering whatever, tobacco, alcohol, cocaine, they're stuck in a form of thinking about themselves. You know, no one likes me. I was just born a loser. It's never going to work out. You know, we all have self-persecutory thoughts. You know, all humans do. But in depression, there's an overexpression of that. There's way too much. And for lack of a better way to put it, good psychedelic therapy is about blasting people out of that narrative, wherever they're stuck. Oh, I'm just a smoker. I've been trying this for years. It's never going to work. I'm just wired this way. People don't like me. I'm depressed. You know, that's just me. I was born with a bad brain. They get blasted out of that story to a much broader perspective. When they look at themselves from that broader perspective, they realize, wow, like, it's not about that. I really do have a choice.
When you describe some of these results as promising, give us a sense of order of magnitude. Is it just a few % more or radically more?
Oh, really radically more. So for example, tobacco smoking, I've done a lot of work using psilocybin, the agent in magic mushrooms, to help people overcome a cigarette addiction. And typical success rates, let's say 6 months after your quit attempt, range from anywhere from, you know, depending on the treatment, 5, 10%, up to even the best treatments around 30% of people still abstinent, you know, not smoking 6 months later. In our first, you know, small pilot, open label pilot study, at 6 months, we had 80% of our participants still smoke-free, biologically confirmed. So we checked their breath and their urine, and we asked them, so trust but verify, but yeah, they were squeaky clean, 80% of these folks. And then even at 2.5 years on average, it was 60% of those folks were still smoke-free. So that really blows out of the water typical results. For depression, down the line, the large majority of people are in remission. The large majority of people would not be diagnosed with depression anymore.
Give us a quick snapshot on where we stand with FDA approval and commercialization. How likely are people to see these as available solutions?
I think it's very likely that we're going to see a FDA-approved clinical use of both MDMA and psilocybin within the next few years. MDMA is closest. The work that some great colleagues have done for years now using MDMA to treat PTSD, that has gone through phase 3 trials. That's the term for the final type of trials that you need for FDA to look at the data and either decide whether this is safe and effective or not. 2 phase 3 trials have been conducted, so we may only be a year or 2 away from MDMA being approved for PTSD. We may be only a year or 2 behind that with psilocybin being approved for depression, tobacco use disorder, alcohol use disorder. All of this depends on the phase 3 data and on the FDA's decision, so I don't want to get ahead of that, but given the results so far, I would place large bets on the fact that, you know, both of these psychedelics are going to be approved in just a few years and available for clinical use.
You're in these conversations daily. What's one of the most common misconceptions you're asked about?
A common misconception is that psychedelic therapy is really a chemical crutch. You know, folks might say, oh, the last thing we need is another way to numb the person out or just to help you skate past your problems. And that's really a radical misunderstanding from my perspective of what's going on here. Yes, this is a medication. In the short term, it induces a profound effect on the way the brain functions. But during that time, that's a window of opportunity where the person learns new things about themselves and about the world. They see themselves from a different perspective. And it just strikes me that when this works, people have this profound sense that they've done their own psychological heavy lifting. Like at the end of one of these sessions, people will say they're exhausted at the physical, mental, and if they use that language, the spiritual level. And often people will say, my God, especially people that like have never taken a psychedelic before, they say, my God, people do this for fun? Like, that's crazy. This was the most difficult thing I've ever done in my life. People routinely say that, not always, but very common. And a lot of times that healing comes from having looked at themselves in the mirror and gone to the dark places and looked at themselves from this radically truthful perspective with their own problems, and they see their own, where they need to improve. And people, when it works, people come out with marching orders from themselves. It was like, this is what I need to do in life to get on a better track. And so it's a message of personal responsibility and continual self-healing. And so when we're picking up on less depression, less addiction 6 months, a year later, the drug's been out of their system. It was out of their system in a day. Like, what we're seeing there months later is they put themselves onto a better track in life. And they've changed the way they're living their lives with responsibility and taking care of themselves.
Dr. Johnson, thank you for being in conversation today, and importantly for these decades of research and really pioneering work to drive what so clear is on your heart will make human flourishing more available for the rest of the world. Appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Evan.